On the evening of March 14, 1983, a CIA officer sat alone in a Vienna cafe, watching snow collect on the windowsill while pretending to read a newspaper he'd already memorized. His name was David Ashford, and in approximately 17 minutes, he was scheduled to make contact with a woman he'd been ordered to seduce. Her name was Natasha Volkov. She worked as a translator at the Soviet embassy, and according to the file hidden in his briefcase, she was lonely, idealistic, and vulnerable, which made her, in the language of intelligence work, an asset waiting to be acquired. He'd done this before, twice in Beirut, once in Prague. The protocol was clinical: establish rapport, manufacture intimacy, extract information, and vanish before emotional complications could compromise operational security. But as he sat there, stirring cold coffee and watching his breath fog the window, David felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years of service: doubt. Not about the mission, about himself. The cafe door opened. A woman entered, shaking snow from her dark hair. David looked up. Their eyes met. And in that single, unplanned moment, the carefully constructed machinery of espionage began to break down. To understand what happened next, you must first understand the world they inhabited. A world where affection itself had become weaponized, where love was just another entry in an operational playbook, and where the line between truth and performance had been erased so many times that even the performers forgot which side they stood on. The year was 1983. The Cold War had entered what historians would later call its second phase, a period of renewed hostility following the brief détente of the 1970s. Ronald Reagan sat in the White House, speaking openly about the evil empire while secretly authorizing covert operations across 3 continents. In Moscow, Yuri Andropov, former KGB chairman turned General Secretary, presided over a surveillance state so vast and intricate that even the watchers were being watched. Vienna occupied a unique position in this divided world, technically neutral. The Austrian capital had become what intelligence officers called a marketplace, a city where East met West, not on battlefields, but in hotel lobbies, opera houses, and dimly lit restaurants, where conversations were conducted in whispers and every smile concealed calculation. The CIA maintained a significant presence there, operating out of the American embassy on Boltzmann under diplomatic cover. The KGB did the same from the Soviet compound on Riesnerstrasse. And between these two poles of power, ordinary people lived ordinary lives, unaware that their city had become a chessboard where human beings were moved like pieces in a game they'd never consented to play. David Ashford had arrived in Vienna 6 months earlier with a legend, a false identity, so carefully constructed that even he sometimes forgot it wasn't real. On paper, he was a cultural attach specializing in American literature. He gave lectures at the university, attended book readings, and maintained a small apartment in the First District with creaking floorboards and radiators that clanged in the night. His real job, of course, was something else entirely. He worked for the CIA's Soviet East European Division, specifically a unit that specialized in what the agency delicately termed human intelligence operations, which meant recruiting spies, turning assets, and exploiting the vulnerabilities of anyone who might provide access to Soviet secrets. The work required a particular temperament: patience, ruthlessness, and the ability to manufacture intimacy on command. David possessed all 3 qualities. His performance reviews described him as exceptionally capable and emotionally disciplined. His case officer in Langley had once written, "Ashford understands that sentiment is a liability. He will go far." The operation targeting Natasha Volkov had been in development for 4 months. She'd first appeared in the CIA's files as a peripheral figure, a junior translator assigned to routine correspondence at the Soviet embassy. Initial surveillance suggested nothing remarkable. A woman in her late 20s who lived alone, walked to work regardless of weather, and spent her evenings reading in coffee houses rather than socializing with other embassy staff. That isolation, however, had attracted attention. Isolation suggested dissatisfaction. And dissatisfaction, properly cultivated, could be transformed into betrayal. The file David had studied contained everything the agency knew about her. Born in Leningrad in 1955 to a family of minor academics, father a professor of French literature, mother a librarian. Both dead now, the father from a heart attack in 1978, the mother from cancer 2 years later. Natasha had studied English and German at Leningrad State University, where her academic performance was excellent, but her political enthusiasm was noted as adequate rather than exemplary. A subtle mark of caution in a system that demanded visible loyalty. She'd been assigned to the Vienna posting in 1981, likely as a reward for her language skills rather than any particular ideological commitment. The psychological profile prepared by CIA analysts painted a picture of quiet melancholy. Subject displays characteristics consistent with mild depression and social withdrawal. No known romantic attachments. Limited interaction with embassy colleagues outside required functions. Spend significant time alone. Assessment: potentially receptive to external validation and emotional connection. Recruitment probability: moderate to high. In other words, she was lonely. And loneliness could be exploited. The plan was straightforward. David would engineer a seemingly accidental meeting, establish rapport through shared interests, literature, music, European culture, and gradually deepen the relationship until trust was established. Once emotional dependency developed, he would begin the careful process of solicitation. Small requests at first, nothing that seemed dangerous. Just minor details about embassy operations, staffing, procedures, information that barely qualified as intelligence. And then slowly, incrementally, he would guide her toward more significant betrayals, using affection as both incentive and insurance. It was a textbook operation, the kind David had executed successfully before. But textbooks, as he was about to discover, couldn't account for every variable, especially not the ones hidden in his own heart. She ordered tea without milk and sat by the window, opening a book whose spine was so worn that David couldn't read the title from across the room. He waited 3 minutes, long enough to seem natural, short enough to appear spontaneous, and then rose from his table, carrying his newspaper. "Excuse me," he said in German, his accent deliberately American. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up. Her eyes were gray, the color of Viennese winter skies. "It's empty," she replied in English, with a Russian accent that softened the consonants. "Please." He sat down, unfolding the newspaper as if that had been his intention all along. For perhaps 90 seconds, neither spoke. Then David glanced at her book and allowed a smile of recognition to cross his face. "Chekhov," he said. "The lady with the dog?" She seemed surprised. "You know, I teach American literature at the university," David said, delivering the first line of his legend. "But I've always believed you can't understand storytelling without reading the Russians. Chekhov especially. The way he finds tragedy in small moments. He let the thought trail off, as if words had failed him. Natasha studied him for a moment. "Most Americans I meet in Vienna don't read Chekhov." "Most Americans I meet don't read at all," David replied, and she laughed, a brief, genuine sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it pleased him. That was how it began. Not with drama or seduction, but with a conversation about literature in a cafe while snow fell outside and the world carried on, indifferent to the machinery being set in motion. They talked for 40 minutes. David learned that she'd read American writers in translation, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, and found them both fascinating and strange, as if they came from a civilization that believed different things about happiness. She learned that he'd grown up in Boston, studied at Columbia, and come to Vienna because he was tired of New York's noise, all elements of his cover story, delivered with the practiced ease of someone who'd become his own fiction. When she finally rose to leave, David made sure to seem reluctant. "Would you ... double quotes," he began, then stopped, as if uncertain whether to continue. "Would you like to meet again? I'd enjoy continuing this conversation." She hesitated. For 3 seconds, David saw her calculating risks, weighing protocols, considering consequences. Then something in her face softened. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." They agreed to meet the following Tuesday at the same cafe. As she walked out into the snow, David remained seated, maintaining the appearance of a man returning to his reading. But his mind was already composing the contact report he would file later that evening. First meeting successful. Subject responsive. Recommend continued cultivation. What he didn't write, what he couldn't quite articulate even to himself, was the brief, unwelcome sensation he'd felt when she smiled. It had felt real. Over the next 6 weeks, David Ashford became the most dangerous thing an intelligence officer can become: genuinely interested in his target. They met twice a week, always at cafes or museums, never at either's residence, maintaining the boundaries of operational security even as those boundaries began to feel increasingly arbitrary. They discussed books and politics, history and music. Natasha spoke about her childhood in Leningrad, the cramped apartment she'd shared with her parents, the way her father would recite French poetry while cooking dinner. David spoke about Boston winters in university libraries and a fictional childhood that felt more real each time he described it. The rules of the operation required him to report everything. After each meeting, he would return to his apartment, pull out the encrypted notepad hidden behind a loose brick in the kitchen wall, and transcribe their conversations with clinical precision. He noted the topics she seemed passionate about: her father's memory, the beauty of Russian literature, her frustration with bureaucratic absurdities. He documented her vulnerabilities, the sadness that flickered across her face when she mentioned being far from home, the way she seemed to brighten when someone showed genuine interest in her thoughts. And he carefully recorded the small incremental victories that suggested the operation was proceeding according to plan. The way she'd begun arriving early to their meetings, the increasing intimacy of the subjects she discussed, the moment she'd touched his hand while laughing at something he'd said. Every detail went into the file. But there were other details he didn't report. The way she tilted her head when listening carefully, the small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident involving broken glass, the fact that she always ordered the same tea, black, no sugar, and would cup her hands around the mug as if drawing warmth from it. These observations served no operational purpose. They were simply ... noticed. By the 7th week, David had begun the gentle process of solicitation. It started with a question that seemed innocent, even natural given their conversations. "You must see interesting diplomatic correspondence in your work. I imagine translating between Russian and German must reveal fascinating cultural differences." Natasha had smiled, but something guarded appeared in her eyes. "I translate administrative documents mostly. Nothing fascinating. Visa applications, shipping manifests, routine correspondence. It's quite boring, actually." "Still," David persisted gently, "you must occasionally see things that surprise you. Differences in how each side describes the same events. She'd changed the subject. The following week he tried again, this time approaching it differently. "I sometimes wonder what this all looks like from your perspective. Americans are so convinced of their own righteousness. Do Soviets see it the same way? That they're the ones defending civilization?" This time she didn't deflect. Instead, she looked directly at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "David," she said quietly, "we should talk about literature, or music, or anything except politics." "Why?" he asked, maintaining his cover of innocent curiosity. "Because," she replied, and now her voice carried something harder. Something that made him realize she understood more than he'd assumed. "Some conversations are dangerous, even in Vienna. Especially in Vienna." She'd looked at him then with an intensity that felt like recognition, as if she could see through the carefully constructed performance to whatever lay beneath. David had experienced that moment before, the moment when an asset realized what was happening. Usually it led to either recruitment or termination of contact. Either they became willing collaborators, or they walked away. But Natasha did neither. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I like you," she said. "I don't want to lose this, so please, don't ask me things that could ruin it." And David, trained to recognize manipulation, schooled in the architecture of deception, found himself simply nodding. "All right," he said. "I won't." It was the first time he'd abandoned operational procedure. It would not be the last. 3 months into the operation, David filed a report that troubled his case officer. Subject continues to resist solicitation. Emotional connection established, but not translating to intelligence cooperation. Subject appears aware of approach and is consciously maintaining boundaries. Assessment. Recruitment unlikely through current methodology. Recommend consideration of alternative strategies or termination of operation. The response came back within 48 hours. Marked priority. Continue cultivation. Deepen emotional dependency. Subject's resistance indicates awareness of risk, suggesting access to valuable information. Do not terminate contact. Increase frequency of meetings. Consider physical intimacy as escalation pathway, if appropriate. Operational timeline extended. Results expected within 60 days. David read the message 3 times, each reading producing a different reaction. First came professional understanding. The logic was sound. Then came unease. He was being instructed to deepen a relationship that had already begun to feel uncomfortably real. And finally came something he hadn't expected: anger. Consider physical intimacy as escalation pathway. The clinical language couldn't disguise what was being asked. He was being told to sleep with her. Not because he wanted to, not because she wanted to, but because it might make her more willing to betray her country. He'd done it before. In Beirut, with a banker's wife who had access to financial records. In Prague, with a secretary who worked for a high-ranking party official. Both times he'd approached it as just another aspect of the work. Unpleasant, perhaps, but necessary. And both times he'd managed to maintain the crucial internal distance that separated performance from reality. But this felt different. Natasha felt different. David found himself sitting at his kitchen table at 3 a.m, staring at the encrypted notepad, trying to compose an operational plan for something he no longer wanted to do. The apartment was silent except for the clanging radiators and the distant sound of a tram passing on Ringstrasse. Outside, Vienna slept under a fresh layer of snow, beautiful and indifferent. He thought about the woman he'd been meeting for 3 months. The way she laughed at his jokes, even the bad ones. The way she'd begun to relax in his presence, shedding some of the careful guardedness that seemed to define her interactions with everyone else. The way she'd recently started calling him by his first name without the slight hesitation that had marked their earlier conversations. And he thought about the lie he'd been living. Every story he'd told her about his childhood, false. Every opinion he'd expressed about literature and politics, calculated. Every moment of apparent vulnerability, performed. He'd been playing a character so consistently that sometimes he forgot where the performance ended and his actual self began. But sitting there in the dark, David felt something crack inside him. A fracture in the carefully maintained wall between operational necessity and human conscience. The truth was simple and terrible. He liked her. Not the way an intelligence officer likes a useful asset. The way a person likes another person. And more than that, though he barely admitted it to himself, he was beginning to love her. Their next meeting was supposed to be at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, where David had planned to continue the slow process of solicitation while pretending to admire Baroque paintings. But when Natasha arrived, she looked different, more serious, almost resolved. "Can we walk instead?" she asked. They walked through the Volksgarten, where spring was beginning to show itself in patches of green beneath the melting snow. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Natasha stopped by a fountain that hadn't yet been turned on for the season. "I need to tell you something," she said, and her voice carried the weight of a decision already made. "And after I tell you, you can decide if you want to continue seeing me." David felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment of recruitment or rejection. Everything he'd worked toward for 4 months. I know what you are, she said quietly. The words hung in the cold air between them. David's training kicked in immediately. Deny, deflect, maintain cover. I don't understand, please, she interrupted, and there was no anger in her voice. Only sadness. Don't insult me with more lies. I've known for weeks. Maybe I've known from the beginning. He said nothing, running through contingency protocols in his mind. If she knew, if she'd reported him to her superiors, there would already be consequences. The fact that she was standing here, alone, telling him this. You're CIA, she continued. You were assigned to recruit me. Every conversation we've had, every moment we've shared, it was all part of an operation. I was a target, Natasha, let me finish. She looked at him directly now, and her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that I understand. And I want you to understand something too. Despite knowing what you are and why you approach me, I fell in love with you anyway. The confession struck him with more force than any accusation could have. I know it's foolish, she continued. I know it's dangerous. I know that everything you've told me about yourself is probably a lie. But somewhere in all those lies, I found something real. Or at least, I wanted to believe I did. David stood frozen, trapped between the requirements of his profession and the sudden, overwhelming weight of his own guilt. I can't give you what you want, Natasha said. I can't betray my country. No matter how much I might disagree with certain things, no matter how isolated and alone I feel. I can't do that. My father spent his entire life believing in something larger than himself, even when that something disappointed him. I won't dishonor his memory by becoming a traitor. She paused, wiping her eyes quickly. But I also can't stop seeing you, even knowing what you are, even knowing that this will probably end badly. So I'm asking you to make a choice. Either continue this relationship knowing that I will never give you intelligence, or walk away now. Because I can't live in this gray area anymore. I need the truth. Even if the truth is that you were only pretending. David looked at this woman who just stripped away every layer of operational security with brutal honesty. Everything in his training told him to walk away, to file a report, to let the agency decide next steps. She'd made herself useless as an asset. There was no operational reason to continue. But standing there in the cold garden with spring struggling to emerge from winter, David Ashford made a decision that would destroy everything he'd built. I wasn't pretending, he said quietly. Not anymore. Maybe at first, but ... He stopped, trying to find words for something he'd never had to articulate before. You were right. There was something real. Is something real. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for lying to you. Natasha stared at him, searching his face for truth. What does that mean? She asked. It means, David said, feeling the weight of the words even as he spoke them, that I choose you, not the operation, you. It was the moment he crossed the line, the moment affection became treason. And neither of them understood yet just how deadly that choice would be. For 6 weeks, they lived in a strange limbo, a relationship that existed in defiance of both their nation's interests and, more dangerously, in defiance of the intelligence apparatus that neither could escape. David stopped filing operational reports. Instead, he submitted vague updates that suggested the cultivation was ongoing but yielding no results, buying time while he tried to figure out what to do. Natasha continued her work at the embassy, maintaining her routines, giving no indication that anything had changed. But between them, something profound had shifted. They were no longer intelligence officer and asset. They were simply two people in love, trapped in a system designed to prevent exactly that. They met carefully, always in public places, but never the same location twice. David taught Natasha about American literature, the real literature, not the propagandistic interpretations she'd studied in university. She taught him about Russian poetry, reciting Akhmatova and Saveteva in her native language while he listened, unable to understand the words, but moved by the sound of them. This is impossible, you know, she said one evening as they sat in a small restaurant in the 7th District, far from both embassies. We can't continue like this. I know, David replied. Eventually, someone will notice. Your people or mine? I know. And when they do, ... double quotes. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They both understood the consequences of what they were doing. In the vocabulary of intelligence work, David was guilty of operational compromise, which was the polite term for treason. Natasha was guilty of contact with a foreign agent, which in the Soviet system could mean imprisonment, or worse. We could leave, David said suddenly. Both of us. Disappear. Natasha looked at him with an expression that mixed hope and despair. Where would we go? Your people would hunt you for betraying them. My people would hunt me on principle. There's nowhere safe for two spies who refuse to spy. Then what do we do? She reached across the table and took his hand. We have this. For as long as we can, and when it ends, we'll face whatever comes. It was a plan born of desperation and doomed from the start, but for a brief time, it was enough. They didn't notice when the surveillance began. That was the point of good surveillance. It remained invisible until the moment it needed to be revealed. But somewhere in the third week of May, a KGB officer named Viktor Petrov started following Natasha Volkov. He'd been ordered to do so by the embassy security section after routine review of personnel movements revealed an anomaly. Natasha had been spending unusual amounts of time away from her apartment, visiting locations outside her normal patterns, and on 3 occasions had been observed in conversation with unidentified individuals. It was probably nothing. Most anomalies were. But in the paranoid arithmetic of Soviet intelligence, probably nothing required investigation anyway. Petrov was good at his job. He kept his distance, changed his appearance, never followed the same route twice. Within a week, he'd identified the pattern. Natasha was meeting regularly with an American, a man who claimed to work at the university, but whose movements suggested training in counter-surveillance. The contact was always in public places, always brief enough to seem innocent, but the frequency suggested significance. Petrov filed his report. And several thousand miles away in Langley, Virginia, a different officer was filing a different report with identical concerns. David Ashford had stopped providing useful intelligence. His operational updates were vague, his contact reports minimal. More troubling, Signals Intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting that Natasha Volkov remained in her position with no indication of compromise, which meant David's operation had either failed or he was lying about his progress. The agency's response was clinical and predictable: increase surveillance on both parties, determine if the operation had been compromised, and prepare contingency protocols for extraction or termination as necessary. By the first week of June, David and Natasha were being watched by both sides. Neither knew it yet. But the net was tightening. The warning, the first indication that something had changed, came on a Tuesday evening in mid-June, when David returned to his apartment and found his books arranged differently on the shelf. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice, but intelligence officers were trained to notice. He'd left them alphabetically ordered by author. Now they were arranged by size. Someone had searched his apartment and wanted him to know it. David stood in the doorway for a full minute calculating. A hostile search would have been invisible, the KGB or Austrian. Counterintelligence would have photographed everything and left no trace. This was different. This was a message from his own side. We're watching. We know something's wrong. Get back in line. He checked the brick in the kitchen where he kept his encrypted notepad. Still there, undisturbed. They'd left his communications equipment intact, which meant they didn't want to burn him yet. They wanted to see what he would do. David sat at his kitchen table and tried to think like the case officers who were evaluating him. They suspected he'd been compromised, either turned by the KGB or emotionally compromised by his target. The search was designed to provoke a response: a panicked attempt to contact his handlers, a rush to warn Natasha, or simply a return to operational normalcy. Any of those reactions would provide data. He did nothing. For 3 days he maintained his routine exactly as before. He went to the university, gave his lectures, graded papers, and avoided all contact with Natasha. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, knowing she'd be waiting at their usual cafe, wondering if something had happened, worrying. But any attempt to contact her now would confirm surveillance and put her at greater risk. On the fourth day, a man approached him at a bookstore on Rotentrumstrasse. "Mr. Ashford? David Ashford?" David turned. The man was middle-aged, American, wearing a gray suit that screamed government official trying to look civilian. "My name is Richard Collins," the man said, showing credentials that identified him as a State Department political officer, standard diplomatic cover for senior CIA personnel. "I wonder if you might have time for coffee. There are some matters regarding your academic work that required discussion. It wasn't a request." They went to a cafe David had never visited before, carefully chosen for counter-surveillance. Collins ordered for both of them, then sat back and studied David with the detached interest of a scientist examining a failed experiment. "You've been in Vienna for 9 months now," Collins began. "Your initial reports were excellent. Detailed, actionable intelligence on Soviet embassy operations, identification of several potential recruitment targets, and successful cultivation of subject Volkov. Your case officer in Langley was quite impressed." David said nothing, waiting. "But for the past 2 months, your reports have been sparse. Subject Volkov remains uncultivated. No intelligence produced. No progress toward recruitment." Collins paused, sipping his coffee. "This troubles us, David. It suggests either incompetence, which your record doesn't support, or compromise, which your continued liberty doesn't support. So we're left with a third possibility, which is that you've gone native," Collins said flatly. "That you've allowed emotional involvement to supersede operational discipline. That you've forgotten which side you work for." David met the older man's eyes. "I work for the United States of America. That hasn't changed, doesn't it?" Collins leaned forward. "Because, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're protecting an asset who's given you nothing. You meet with her regularly, you spend time with her. You've developed what appears to be a genuine relationship, and yet she remains completely useless to us. That's not how this works, David, you know that." "She can't be turned," David said carefully. "I've assessed the situation thoroughly. She's aware of approach, resistant to recruitment, and attempting to leverage her would likely result in exposure. It's a failed operation. I should have filed a termination recommendation weeks ago. Then why didn't you?" The question hung between them. "I was hoping circumstances would change," David said, which was both true and completely inadequate. Collins shook his head slowly. "I'm going to be direct with you, David, because I think you're smart enough to understand the situation you're in. We know about the relationship. We know it's gone beyond operational necessity. And we know that Natasha Volkov is not providing intelligence. Those 3 facts together paint a very troubling picture." He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "This is a reassignment order. You're being pulled from Vienna, effective immediately. You'll return to Langley for debriefing and reassessment. Depending on what that review determines, you'll either be reassigned to a desk position or face more serious consequences." David stared at the folder, understanding immediately what was happening. They were removing him from the board, neutralizing what they saw as a compromised asset. It was standard procedure, actually quite merciful given what they suspected. "And Natasha?" he asked quietly. Collins's expression hardened. "Subject Volkov is no longer your concern. She'll be handled by other personnel using different approaches. You're to have no further contact with her. Consider that a direct order." "What does that mean, different approaches?" "It means," Collins said, standing up and leaving money on the table, "that we're going to try approaches that don't depend on an officer who's forgotten how to separate his work from his heart. Your flight leaves Thursday morning. A car will collect you at 0600. Pack only personal items. Your operational materials will be collected separately." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, David, I understand. I've been doing this work for 23 years. I've seen good officers make the same mistake. You met someone who made you feel human again, and that's a powerful thing when you've been pretending for so long. But the work doesn't care about your feelings. It never has. And the people who depend on our work, the country we're sworn to protect. They can't afford for us to forget that. Collins walked away, leaving David alone with the folder and a choice that had already been made for him. David didn't return to his apartment. Instead, he walked for hours through Vienna's streets, thinking with a clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis. The facts were simple. He'd been compromised, not by enemy action, but by his own emotions. He was being pulled from the field, and Natasha, who'd done nothing except refuse to betray her country and make the mistake of falling in love with the wrong person, was about to become the target of different approaches, which could mean anything from heightened surveillance to active measures designed to coerce cooperation. In the language of intelligence work, she'd become what was called a pressure point. The agency would assume that David's feelings for her were reciprocated. They'd use that assumption. They'd threaten her, investigate her, possibly even arrange for her to be expelled from Austria, knowing that return to Moscow under suspicion of contact with Western intelligence would mean interrogation, imprisonment, or execution. And they'd do all of this not because Natasha had betrayed anyone, but because the machinery of espionage, once set in motion, crushed everything in its path. David thought about his career, 8 years of service, dozens of successful operations, a reputation for excellence that had been destroyed in 4 months of authentic feeling. He thought about his country, which he genuinely believed he was serving by conducting operations in the shadows. And he thought about the woman who'd seen through his lies and loved him anyway, who'd refused to betray her principles even when it would have been easier to surrender. The choice was obvious. He couldn't save his career, but he could save her. At 8:30 that evening, David walked into the Soviet embassy on Risnerstrasse. The guard at the entrance looked at him with immediate suspicion. Americans didn't simply walk into Soviet facilities, especially not at night. "I need to speak with security," David said in German. "It's urgent. It concerns Natasha Volkov." 20 minutes later, he was sitting in a windowless room being interrogated by Viktor Petrov, the same KGB officer who'd been following Natasha for weeks. "You are CIA," Petrov said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And you were running an operation against Natasha Volkov?" "Yes." "Why are you here?" David took a breath. What he was about to do would end everything, his career, his freedom, possibly his life. But it was the only way. "Because you're about to make a mistake," he said. "You've been watching Natasha. You think she's compromised. You're planning to recall her to Moscow for investigation. And when you do, she'll be interrogated, possibly imprisoned, certainly destroyed, all for something she didn't do." Petrov leaned back, studying him. "Go on." "She refused recruitment," David said. "From the beginning she understood what I was and refused to cooperate. She never provided intelligence. She never betrayed anything. The only thing she's guilty of is poor judgment in who she spent time with. Why should I believe you?" "Because I'm turning myself in," David replied. "Because I have no reason to lie now. My career is over either way. I'm telling you this because ... double quotes," he paused, searching for words that would make sense to a KGB officer who'd spent his life in a world where affection was weakness and loyalty meant obedience. "Because she deserves better than to be destroyed by a system that treats people as pawns." Petrov studied him for a long moment. "You realize what you're confessing? You've admitted to espionage on Austrian soil. We could notify the Austrian authorities. You'd be arrested, tried, imprisoned. I know. You could also be useful to us. A CIA officer willing to cooperate. We could arrange for your defection. You'd provide information about American operations, and in return, you'd be protected." David shook his head. "I'm not defecting. I'm not cooperating. I'm simply telling you the truth about Natasha Volkov so that you don't punish her for something she didn't do. After that, you can do whatever you want with me." Petrov stood and left the room without another word. David sat alone for 3 hours, waiting. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Petrov who entered. It was Natasha. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her expression a mixture of shock and anguish. "They told me what you did," she said quietly. "They told me you walked in here and confessed everything." "I had to," David replied. "They were going to come after you. So you sacrificed yourself. David, do you understand what you've done? You've admitted to espionage. The Austrians will arrest you. You'll spend years in prison. Your own country will disavow you. And for what? To protect someone who can't be protected? She crossed the room and knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. I told them the truth, she continued, her voice breaking. I told them exactly what you told them. That I refused recruitment, that I never provided intelligence, that the only thing I'm guilty of is caring about the wrong person. And do you know what they said? David said nothing, just looked at her. They said it doesn't matter. That contact with Western intelligence, regardless of outcome, constitutes a security violation. That I've compromised myself simply by knowing you. I'm being recalled to Moscow tomorrow for debriefing. We both know what that means. She wiped her eyes angrily. So your sacrifice was meaningless, David. You destroyed yourself for nothing. We're both finished. No, David said firmly. Listen to me. I have one more play. It's desperate, and it probably won't work, but it's all I have left. He explained quickly, quietly, aware that every word was likely being recorded. The Americans are pulling me out Thursday morning. They think I'm compromised, but they don't know I came here. If I can get to the airport before they realize what I've done, if I can make it back to the States, I can request asylum for you through formal channels. It's a long shot. The diplomatic complications would be enormous, but it's possible. The U.S. grants asylum to Soviet citizens who want to defect. If you could get to the American embassy before your flight to Moscow— They're watching me, Natasha interrupted. I'm confined to the embassy compound until departure. I can't just walk out. Then I'll create a reason for them to let you out. A medical emergency, something that requires hospital treatment. The Austrians won't allow the Soviets to prevent emergency medical care. If we can get you to a hospital, you can request asylum from there. Petrov's voice came from a speaker mounted in the ceiling. This conversation is over. Miss Volkov, return to your quarters, Mr. Ashford. You will remain here until the Austrian authorities are notified. Natasha stood slowly, looking down at David with an expression of impossible sadness. I love you, she said. I want you to know that was real. Everything else was politics and ideology and games that neither of us chose to play. But what I feel for you, that was real. I know, David said. I love you too, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it. The lies, the manipulation, the fact that we met under circumstances that made anything real impossible. But I'm not sorry for loving you. That's the only true thing I've done in years. She reached down and touched his face gently. In another life, she said softly, we could have been happy. In another life, David agreed. Then she turned and walked out, escorted by 2 guards who'd been waiting in the corridor. David sat alone in the interrogation room, listening to the fluorescent lights buzz overhead and understanding that he'd just witnessed the last moment of something that should never have existed, but that he would remember for the rest of his life. What happened next unfolded with the mechanical inevitability of systems designed to crush individual action. The Austrian authorities were notified that an American citizen had confessed to espionage activities on Austrian soil. David was transferred to Austrian custody, where he was held pending formal charges. The American embassy, upon learning of his arrest, immediately invoked diplomatic protocol while simultaneously disavowing any knowledge of his activities, standard procedure when an intelligence officer was compromised. Natasha was confined to the Soviet embassy under guard. Her recall to Moscow was expedited. Within 48 hours, she would be on a flight to Sheremetyevo Airport, where a security team would escort her directly to Lubyanka prison for interrogation. David's desperate plan to create a medical emergency never materialized. The systems were too efficient, the surveillance too complete. There were no gaps through which hope could slip. But something else happened that neither side had anticipated. On Wednesday morning, June 22, 1983, Natasha Volkov was found unconscious in her quarters at the Soviet embassy. An empty bottle of pills lay beside her bed, sleeping medication she'd been prescribed for insomnia months earlier. By the time embassy medical staff reached her, she'd been unconscious for at least 4 hours. The Soviets faced an immediate dilemma: allow her to die, which would trigger an investigation by Austrian authorities and create diplomatic complications, or transport her to an Austrian hospital for treatment, which would mean releasing her from direct custody, even if only temporarily. They chose the hospital. Natasha regained consciousness at Vienna General Hospital late Wednesday afternoon. She was weak, disoriented, but alive. 2 KGB officers stood guard outside her room. Austrian police were stationed in the corridor as well, standard procedure for cases involving foreign nationals and suspicious circumstances. What nobody noticed, what couldn't have been planned, was that the attending physician assigned to her case was Dr. Stefan Hoffmann, an Austrian doctor who'd studied at Columbia University in New York, who spoke fluent English, and who'd once attended a lecture on American literature given by a visiting cultural attaché named David Ashford. Dr. Hoffmann recognized the name on the security alert that accompanied his patient, Natasha Volkov. Soviet embassy staff, suicide attempt, under investigation for potential espionage activities. Contact with American intelligence officer David Ashford and Dr. Hoffmann, who believed in medicine over politics and who'd been raised by parents who'd survived the Nazi occupation by helping people the state had. Marked for destruction, made a decision. Late Wednesday night, he entered Natasha's room and closed the door. "Miss Volkov," he said quietly in English, "I'm going to give you a choice. In approximately 6 hours, you will be discharged into Soviet custody. You will be taken to the airport and flown to Moscow. We both know what happens after that." Natasha looked at him with exhausted comprehension. "Or," Dr. Hoffmann continued, "you could experience a medical complication, a cardiac episode perhaps. Something that requires immediate transfer to the intensive care unit. During that transfer, security might be momentarily compromised. And during that moment, you might find yourself near an exit where Austrian authorities sympathetic to those seeking asylum could be waiting." He placed a small card on her bedside table. "This is the number for the American Embassy's emergency line. If you were to experience such a complication, and if you were to reach a phone during the confusion, you could request immediate asylum. The Americans would be legally obligated to respond." Natasha stared at the card, then at the doctor. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this?" Dr. Hoffmann smiled sadly. "Because I'm a doctor. Because I took an oath to do no harm. And because sometimes, Miss Volkov, the systems we've built are so efficient at destroying people that the only moral response is a small act of sabotage." He walked to the door, then paused. "The guards change shifts at 0400. That's when people are most tired, most likely to make mistakes. If you're going to have a cardiac episode, that would be the time." Then he left, leaving Natasha alone with an impossible choice and approximately 7 hours to make it. At 4:17 a.m. on Thursday morning, monitors at the nurses' station began alarming. Room 347, patient Volkov, was showing cardiac irregularities. Dr. Hoffmann, who'd arranged to be on overnight shift, rushed to the room with a crash cart and 2 nurses. The KGB officers stationed outside moved to follow. But hospital protocol was clear. During medical emergencies, only medical personnel were permitted in the treatment area. The officers could observe through the window, but they couldn't interfere. Inside the room, organized chaos unfolded. Dr. Hoffmann shouted orders, nurses moved with practiced urgency. And somewhere in the controlled pandemonium, Natasha, who'd swallowed nothing more dangerous than water but was performing symptoms Dr. Hoffmann had carefully described, was transferred to a gurney for immediate transport to the ICU. The route to the ICU passed through a service corridor that connected to multiple wings of the hospital. During the transfer, with nurses focused on monitoring equipment and Dr. Hoffmann running ahead to prepare the ICU, Natasha did something that required more courage than anything she'd ever done before. She rolled off the gurney. The nurses cried out. The KGB officers, who'd been following at a distance, began running. But Natasha was already moving, pulling out the IV line, stumbling down a side corridor that Dr. Hoffman had specifically mentioned during his earlier visit. She pushed through a door marked "Restricted Staff Only" and found herself in a stairwell. Down 3 flights, moving on legs that felt like water. Following signs that she couldn't read, but that Dr. Hoffman had described. Turn right at the bottom, through the double doors, past the loading dock. Behind her she could hear shouting in Russian and German. She burst through a final door and found herself in the hospital's delivery area, where trucks unloaded supplies in the pre-dawn darkness. And there, exactly where Dr. Hoffman had suggested they might be, were 2 Austrian police officers and 1 American in a dark suit. "Natasha Volkov?" the American asked quickly. "Yes. I'm Deputy Chief of Mission, American Embassy. Are you requesting political asylum in the United States?" The KGB officers burst through the door behind her. Natasha looked at the Americans, at the Austrians, at her own countrymen who represented everything she'd been taught to serve and everything she'd learned to fear. "Yes," she said. "I request asylum." The American stepped forward, placing himself between Natasha and the Soviet officers. "This woman is now under the protection of the United States government. Under international law, she has the right to request asylum. Any attempt to forcibly remove her will constitute a violation of Austrian sovereignty and international treaty." The senior KGB officer's face was murderous, but he was trapped. They were on Austrian soil, surrounded by Austrian police, and the Americans had acted faster than anyone had anticipated. To forcibly extract Natasha now would create a diplomatic incident that even Moscow would find difficult to justify. "This is not finished," the officer said in English. "She is a Soviet citizen who has violated. She is an individual exercising her human rights," the American interrupted. "Now, gentlemen, I suggest you step back. This matter will be handled through proper diplomatic channels." For 10 seconds, nobody moved. Then the KGB officers, recognizing a situation they couldn't win, withdrew. Natasha felt her legs give out. The American caught her as she fell. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You're safe now." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. She was alive, she was free, but safe, that was another question entirely. David Ashford learned about Natasha's asylum request while sitting in an Austrian detention facility, awaiting formal charges that would never quite materialize. The diplomatic situation had become impossibly complex. An American intelligence officer had confessed to espionage. A Soviet translator had defected. Austrian sovereignty had been violated by both sides, and all of it had played out in a public hospital with witnesses and documentation that couldn't be quietly erased. The solution, ultimately, was the solution that powerful nations always prefer. Everyone pretended nothing had happened. The Austrians quietly released David with the understanding that he would immediately leave the country and never return. The Americans, having no interest in a public trial that would expose operational procedures, agreed. The Soviets, humiliated by Natasha's defection but unwilling to acknowledge the circumstances that led to it, filed a formal protest and then dropped the matter. David was flown back to the United States on a military transport, accompanied by 2 escorts who didn't speak to him during the entire flight. He was debriefed at a facility in Virginia for 3 weeks, a process that was less interrogation than autopsy, dissecting every decision, every moment, every failure of judgment that had led to the collapse of an operation and the exposure of CIA methods. The conclusion was predictable. Subject demonstrated severe operational compromise due to emotional involvement with target. Exhibited pattern of deception regarding recruitment progress. Ultimately committed acts inconsistent with agency interests. Recommendation: immediate termination of employment with prejudice. Security clearance permanently revoked. Subject to be placed under surveillance for a period of no less than 5 years to ensure no further compromise. In bureaucratic language, it meant, "You're fired. You're watched. You're finished." David accepted it without argument. He signed the termination papers, the non-disclosure agreements, the documents that threatened prosecution if he ever spoke publicly about his work. Then he was escorted out of the facility and given a bus ticket to Boston, the city where his fictional identity had supposedly grown up, though he'd never actually lived there. He arrived on a gray afternoon in July with a small suitcase, no job, and a past he couldn't discuss with anyone. But he was alive. And so was Natasha. The rules were clear. David and Natasha were not to have contact. She'd been granted asylum but was considered a defector under review. She would spend months being debriefed by CIA and FBI personnel, her entire life examined, her motives questioned, her reliability assessed. Standard procedure for anyone who crossed from one side to the other. She would eventually be given a new identity, relocated somewhere in the American interior, and expected to build a new life while remaining under periodic observation. He was a former intelligence officer under disgrace, his security clearance revoked, his career destroyed. He was also considered a potential security risk, someone who demonstrated willingness to prioritize personal relationships over national interests. Standard procedure dictated separation. The logic was sound. The cruelty was incidental. David tried twice to make contact through official channels. Both attempts were blocked. He was told, politely but firmly, that Natasha Volkov was no longer his concern, that any attempt to contact her would be considered a violation of his security agreement and might result in prosecution, that for her safety and his own, he needed to move on. So he did the only thing possible. He tried to build a life from the ruins. He worked odd jobs teaching English at a community college under his real name, which felt strange after years of living as someone else. He moved through days that felt hollow, going through motions that seemed pointless. At night he would lie awake in a small apartment in Cambridge and think about a woman he'd met in a Vienna cafe. A woman who'd seen through his lies and loved him anyway. A woman who was somewhere in America now, alive and safe, but unreachable. The agency had taught him to compartmentalize, to separate emotion from duty, to function despite pain. He'd never been worse at it. On a Saturday morning in October 1986, David was sitting in a coffee shop near Harvard Square, grading papers from his Introduction to American Literature class, when someone sat down across from him. He looked up. Natasha Volkov looked older, not in years, but in experience. Her hair was shorter, styled differently. She wore American clothes, jeans, and a sweater, and spoke with an accent that had softened but not disappeared. "Hello, David," she said quietly. For 3 seconds, he couldn't speak. Then, "How did you find me? You're not as hidden as you think, and I'm not as supervised as I used to be. After 3 years of interviews and assessments and proving my reliability, they decided I'm not a threat. They gave me a new name, a new life, and gradually stopped watching quite so carefully." She smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I shouldn't be here. The rules still say we shouldn't have contact. But I needed to see you. I needed to know if what we had was real or if I'd imagined it." David reached across the table and took her hand. "It was real," he said. "It's the most real thing I've ever known." They sat in silence for a moment, holding hands across a small table in a Cambridge coffee shop, two people who'd survived the Cold War by betraying everything except each other. "I can't stay long," Natasha said. "I have a life now. A job, friends, a small apartment in a city I can't tell you about. It's not the life I imagined, but it's mine. And it's more than I would have had if you hadn't walked into that embassy." "Was it worth it?" David asked. "Everything you gave up?" She considered the question seriously. "I lost my country, my language, my past. Everyone I knew thinks I'm either dead or a traitor. I can never go home. I can never see the places where my parents lived. I exist in a kind of permanent exile." She paused, squeezing his hand. "But I'm alive. I'm free. And I got to choose my own betrayals instead of having them chosen for me. So yes, it was worth it." David felt something break inside him, not painfully, but like a thaw after a long winter. "I'm sorry," he said. "For everything. For the lies, for the manipulation, for the way we met. I'm sorry that love became a weapon and that we both got wounded by it." "Don't apologize," Natasha replied. "What we did was impossible, and probably foolish, and it cost us everything. But it was also beautiful in its way. We chose each other over systems designed to prevent exactly that. We chose human connection over ideology. That's not nothing, David. In a world that tried to make us into tools, we insisted on remaining people. She stood up slowly, releasing his hand. I need to go. And I don't think we should see each other again. Not because I don't want to, God knows I want to, but because we both need to build new lives. Real lives. Not ghosts of what we had in Vienna. Will you be okay? David asked. Yes, she said. Will you? I think so. Eventually. She leaned down and kissed him gently on the forehead. The way you might kiss someone you're saying goodbye to forever. In another life, she whispered, we could have been happy. In another life, David agreed. Then she walked out of the coffee shop and disappeared into the Cambridge morning. A woman with a new name and a new life, carrying memories of a love that had survived interrogation, exile, and the machinery of two empires, but couldn't quite survive peace. David sat alone with his papers and his coffee, understanding that he'd just witnessed the final chapter of something that had begun 4 years earlier in a Vienna cafe. The spy who fell in love had paid the ultimate price. Not death. Something harder. Life, without the person who'd made him want to live. The Cold War ended 3 years later, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union began its collapse. The systems that had controlled millions of lives, that had turned ordinary people into spies and lovers into enemies, that had made ideology more important than humanity, all of it crumbled with surprising speed. But the people who'd been broken by those systems didn't magically heal. David Ashford continued teaching literature at small colleges, always moving, never quite settling. He never married. He dated occasionally but found that intimacy had been poisoned by years of performance and lies. Students who knew him described him as brilliant but distant, a man who seemed to be perpetually elsewhere, thinking about something he couldn't articulate. Natasha, whose new name was kept secret to protect her even after the Soviet Union no longer existed to threaten her, built a quiet life working as a translator for a university press. She never married either. She had friends, hobbies, a comfortable routine. But those who knew her well noted that she seemed to carry a sadness she wouldn't discuss, a grief for something lost that couldn't be recovered. They never saw each other again after that morning in Cambridge. But on certain days, the anniversary of their first meeting, the date of her escape, the moment when autumn turned to winter and reminded them both of Vienna, each would think of the other with a mixture of pain and gratitude. What they'd shared had been built on lies and destroyed by truth. But somewhere in between, in the narrow space where espionage became emotion and duty dissolved into love, they'd found something authentic. They'd found each other. And in a world designed to prevent exactly that kind of human connection, their love became a small, quiet form of resistance. Not against capitalism or communism. Against systems that treated people as assets. Against ideologies that made enemies of strangers. Against the machinery of paranoia that had turned half the world into a prison and the other half into a lie. The spy who fell in love paid the ultimate price. But what he purchased with that payment was more valuable than any intelligence, more classified than any secret, more dangerous than any weapon. The knowledge that even in the darkest moments of the Cold War, when nations played games with human lives and ideology demanded sacrifice, love could still exist. Foolish, impossible, doomed love. But love nonetheless. And perhaps that's the real secret that both sides tried to suppress, not nuclear launch codes or troop movements or satellite technology, but the simple, revolutionary truth that human beings will always choose each other over the systems that claim to represent them. Will always find ways to love despite being taught to hate. Will always insist on remaining human, even when the world demands they become something less. The Cold War ended. But the stories of those who survived it, and those who didn't, remain. They deserve to be told, not as propaganda or politics, but as testimony to the cost of systems that treat people as pawns and nations as more important than the individuals who comprise them. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile freedom really was, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten. Stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, of impossible choices and inevitable consequences, of the human cost of ideological conflict. Because the past isn't just history, it's warning. And if we forget what the Cold War did to people like David and Natasha, we risk building new systems just as cruel, just as inhuman, just as willing to sacrifice individual lives for collective abstractions. So remember them. Remember the spy who fell in love. And remember that, in the end, he didn't lose because he chose love over duty. He lost because the world he lived in couldn't imagine that love and duty might sometimes be the same thing.